Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan, and joining me today for our program this evening is Göran Persson, former Prime Minister of Sweden. So you headed your country's government from 1996 to 2006.
Yes.
Welcome to the show. Welcome to Rajya Sabha TV.
Thank you, sir.
Let's start by discussing India-Sweden relations in the context of your prime ministership. India and Sweden have had relations going back to when India became independent. I think Alvar Myrdal was the first Swedish ambassador to India. And there was, of course, apart from the economic cooperation, close political ties, especially whenever Sweden was ruled by social democratic politicians. And then the B word happened, Bofors, cast a huge shadow because of the well-founded allegations in this country that corruption was involved in this arms deal. Of course, by today's standards, it doesn't seem like a huge amount of money, but it's the principle that I think concerned a lot of people, and the sense that the decision-making on the purchase of an important weapon system might have been taken for considerations other than professional ones. And this, I think, for a long time led to a downturn in India-Sweden relations. Now, when you became PM, you were obviously conscious of this. You had to deal with this, the reality of this downturn. But then in 2004, you made a landmark visit to Delhi and, in a way, put the relationship back on the upward trajectory. You want to explain to us a little bit about how you felt the shadow of Bofors as Prime Minister, as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned, and how you decided to move the relationship forward?
I think it was time to take a step forward. Politics is often about timing, to do the right thing at the right moment. And Bofors was something that caused also huge problems inside Sweden. And for many of us who grew up during these years, it was something we not just wanted to put behind us, but also tried to clear out and then go forward, because we needed India as a partner. It's not so difficult to see. Sweden is a small country. We have a big export industry. India is a huge country with tremendous opportunities for the future. We want to be on the Indian market. And on top of that, India had always been a firm supporter of the multilateral systems, foreign policy dimension, also a country reliable and possible always to have a discussion with. We wanted to have a good relation with India because we needed that as a small open economy. And as a radical and progressive government, it was natural to go and meet with Indian not only the government, but also the intellectual society in India, always extremely stimulating.
Right.
So I met at that time with Prime Minister Vajpayee, and the same day when he announced his election,
right,
I arrived here. And then
in fact, they advanced the date of the election by a few months.
Yes, exactly. And they were extremely self-confident, I remember that. And then the election went in another direction. That's how politics works.
But in a way, the crucial breakthrough, as it were, you were fortunate that this occurred during the tenure of Prime Minister Vajpayee, who represented a party which had made Bofors a major issue. And the fact that that government was willing to reach out and say, okay, let's see how we go beyond this hump. Of course, Bofors would remain a live political and even criminal matter in this country for some more time. Perhaps it will remain so for a long time, until the final facts are established. But the fact that you were able to make that visit during Vajpayee's time, even if he was defeated in the elections, I think was an important factor, perhaps.
I think it was helpful, definitely. And it was, so to say, giving us the opportunity on both sides to do a restart for the relations between India and Sweden. I think it had happened nevertheless a couple of years later if I had not taken the initiative, because the time was there to do it. But from a political perspective, it was much easier to do it together with that government, of course.
Right. And then, of course, things rapidly moved ahead from being a country from which India, it was politically very difficult to source major weaponry. Sweden became one of the contenders for our multi-role combat aircraft project, but finally it didn't make the cut. How disappointed were you? You demitted office by the time the decision was taken, obviously, but did you really think the Swedish plane had a fair shot at getting the contract?
It's difficult to say.
Yeah.
It's difficult to say, but I know one thing. That aircraft managed to convince about its ability in South Africa and has recently done so also in Brazil. So young, growing economies on the southern hemisphere have chosen that aircraft, often because it represents an independence in relation to the old strong military forces who often have been prepared to supply with that type of weapon systems to countries around the world.
Right.
So also from that perspective, the Saab Gripen was very attractive. And hopefully we haven't seen everything yet. You don't know where it ends up.
Okay.
You never know.
Always an optimistic politician. But I remember reading at the time that the Indian order was quite crucial for Saab Gripen to actually remain in production. But that hasn't been the case, right? It's continued to remain viable despite the fact that India is not buying.
No, the company is growing and growing strongly. And as I said, the last big deal was with Brazil. And that just sends the signal that this is an aircraft for countries who have a need to find something that is of highest technological capacity, but to lowest possible price. The time is over when military equipment could cost as much as it costed before. Now it is also there a budget control, and we need to have a strict budget control. So the life cost for a military equipment is the most important part, and there Saab has been very competitive.
Do you think international geopolitics is, in a way, making life more difficult for Sweden as a supplier of expensive military equipment like a fighter jet? What I mean is that when a country like India goes in for a major purchase, contracts running into billions of dollars, several billions of dollars, there is an expectation that this is not just an aircraft deal. It would be embedded in perhaps a wider defense relationship or a strategic relationship, where you have quid pro quos, not in the Bofors sense or the alleged Bofors sense, but in terms of gains that you could make in other areas. We've seen that, for example, in India-US relations, India-France relations, where there seems to be a clear connect between India's willingness to buy expensive military equipment and the willingness of those governments to change their policy, say, for example, on the sale of civil nuclear technology to India. These are all factors, undoubtedly. Do you think the fact that Sweden, at the end of the day, is a small player, hampers its ability to do that kind of deal, a wider deal?
That kind of deal, when you're talking about the nuclear sector.
Yeah. No, I use nuclear as an example. There could be other things.
Forget that. But other things, when you're talking about offset deals in connection with these big military deals, Saab and Sweden has always delivered what we have promised. And that is important. Right. Sometimes you do businesses from countries of this kind, and often big promises, but not so much delivered.
Right.
So it has been for the Swedish government extremely important when Saab goes for a deal, for instance, with South Africa, and promise offsets the businesses in connection with that. It's important for the government to see to that is also fulfilled. we are such a small country, so we have to stick to our promises.
Right.
Some big countries have a tendency sometimes to forget that.
So tell us something about your current visit to India. What is it that brings you? What is it that you hope to accomplish?
I have the highest expectation on the Indian development. No doubt, this will be the engine for world economy if your growth will pick up to the potential it has. And you ought to be able to grow between 7 and 10% annually the coming 20 years, 15 years. And so far it has started quite promising. And I have all reason to believe that it will continue. So I will meet with politicians, analysts, others who understand the Indian economy. Because as long as the Indian economy grows, there will also be a political momentum for India for political change and modernization. Without a steady growth rate above 6%, at least 7%, it will also be difficulties to go ahead with the political agenda. But with a modernized India, you have one more extremely independent and important actor on the world scene. The only one who can build a good relation with Africa on top of everything. So Africa-Indian relation, and I have seen the conclusions from the last summit, are very, very important to understand and to follow, because there you have a growth engine for the future. I'm very optimistic.
Do Swedish companies share your bullishness on the Indian economy?
Of course.
Or are they still looking at China and other places?
China is still there, not to forget that, not that type of competition. China has had a fantastic development, but they are coming now to a situation where their growth will slow down, and they have to shift and do the difficult thing to shift from investments in infrastructure and in housing as a driving force for the economy, to shift that to domestic demand instead. It's not so easy to do, and I'm not convinced that China will be so successful about that. It's a much easier process ahead of you in India. You had 20 years with a driving force that you have under control, and that is infrastructure investments and housing will give a tremendous development. That then you also will have to take the next step, and the difficult one. And I will not be surprised if I see China coming up to a situation much like the one we can see in Japan, with a quite sluggish economic growth and a diminishing population. The demographic side of this is underestimated.
Right, particularly because the Chinese had, for many years, one-child policy. Exactly.
And they changed that now,
exactly.
With very good reasons.
That's right.
Yes.
Let's shift focus from the bilateral to Sweden and the role of Sweden in Europe. And of course, the biggest question confronting, or one of the biggest issues, a political challenge, an ethical, a moral challenge confronting Europe has been the influx of refugees from Syria and other war-torn, war-ravaged countries. Now, looking at the European response from afar, as we do from India, we see a variety of views and policies adopted by European governments and European politicians. At one extreme, you have what seems to us, quite frankly, to be xenophobic attitudes, say in Hungary or even Austria, and then a rather more welcoming approach by, say, the government and people of Germany. Sweden has also been has been liberal in this regard. How satisfied are you as a European statesman at the quality and nature of Europe's response to this humanitarian catastrophe?
I'm not satisfied at all, of course. It's a failure. It's a breakdown for the European institutions. A few countries have been able to respond, but if all countries in Europe had done the same thing as Sweden and Germany, this had not been a problem. And one reason why they have not done so is the xenophobic argument. So it's worrying, to say the least.
So it's xenophobia mixed up with Islamophobia, obviously.
Yes.
I mean, that plays a role here, undoubtedly.
Yes. And many countries have literally closed And then a few countries maintained an open attitude and had to take the whole responsibility, among them my own country. Now, we also have been forced to go in a more restrictive direction. And this can...
Forced by what? By pan-European?
By the number
Okay.
of refugees. And I think we receive just now 0.5% of our population as refugees during a very, very short period. So that is, with our way of doing it, it is not possible to maintain. So we need a European cooperation. We need a European distribution of responsibility. If we can do that, it is possible to handle. But if we don't have that distribution, that internal solidarity inside the European Union, it will break down, and it is going to break down.
So what's the current Swedish policy? If a refugee lands up on Swedish territory or on the Swedish frontier, because you don't have checks within the EU, so how does this work? I mean, you apply without question the principle of non-refoulement, obviously. What's the status that a refugee would then enjoy within Sweden?
They have the right to seek for asylum, of course. And if they don't have arguments for asylum, they will be returned to the country they came from. And that is probably another European country. And that is the principles we are following. So, and then we had a situation where just two countries stuck to those principles, and then all refugees came to Germany and Sweden, more or less.
Yes.
And therefore, we have to challenge the other European countries to take their part of the responsibility. Because, and that is important, Europe needs immigration. Europe is an aging continent. It's a graying continent. Especially goes that for Germany, for instance. And the eastern part of Europe, with a xenophobic discussion, they are also aging societies. They need newcomers that want to contribute to their societies. And one reason why Sweden have had such a good economic development during many years have been that we have had an increased population. And an increased population that works and studies. That population also bring economic growth.
Absolutely.
So what Europe needs is not to close, but to open up, but to do it under a controlled regime. And that is what have failed. And we will have a discussion in Europe now, not about the internal borders inside the European Union. We are all in favor of having a Europe without internal borders, but it doesn't work if you don't have control of your external borders.
So is there a danger of internal borders reappearing? I mean, the joke always used to be about the European Union that you would have rules about the size of a carrot and whether beer should be served as a liter or as a pint. But on something so fundamental as respecting the Refugee Convention, if there are going to be disagreements and hence the burden of refugees falls entirely on one or two countries, is there not a danger that some of the other arrangements that have emerged over the years, like a borderless Europe,
of course,
would have to go out of the window?
We have two projects in Europe that is extremely important. One is Europe as an internal market with the freedom for people, goods, services and capital to move. That is one achievement we have had. The second one is the Euro project. Both these projects are now under severe pressure, and we need to solve that. And the Euro process is, I think that is easier to handle, because I think it's so easy to see what you have to do, even if that is painful.
Right.
The refugee crisis challenge political forces inside European countries that are of right-wing extremism, and that might bring a new type of political climate.
How worried are you about that in Sweden? I mean, you're a social democrat.
Yes,
and we've seen in many countries the right wing gaining on the backs of this sort of a problem. How much of a danger is it in Sweden, and how we've seen with the Le Pen, with the National Front National in France, the kind of headway they've made. I mean, this is a real concern.
Yes, it is a real concern. And we have that type of party almost inside every European country. And it's not always about xenophobic dimension. Mostly, yes, but not always. There is also a social dimension. People who have lost their job, rural areas who have been more or less forgotten, tensions in society that is growing. That is an atmosphere, a climate for movements of this kind to start to grow. And the xenophobic issue is often used as a start for such a process. But there are also social reasons behind the situation that we have to attack, and we can attack. Europe is, after all, a rich continent, and some countries still have a good economic development, others is in a sluggish development. We need to focus on the internal distribution in our countries to have a fair distribution. Right. If there are big groups who feel that they are left alone, that they are coming behind, then you have an atmosphere for this xenophobic discussion.
You've been lucky in Sweden in not having to confront terrorism in the way that the UK or Spain or Italy or France has had.
Of that kind.
You lost a prime minister, you've lost a foreign minister, but to assassin's bullets. But
yes.
This kind of mass terror, as we saw in France recently, is something which, fortunately, you have escaped in Sweden. Do you think that the revelation that one or two of the attackers misused refugee status, or in any case, the fact that they came from or were part of immigrant communities, will vitiate the ongoing debate on refugees as well as multiculturalism and migration? Do you feel that sense in Sweden too?
Of course, it's a European debate, and it's easy to see the connection in the discussion. Then it is, of course, a disaster if we don't are able to separate what is what.
Exactly.
And it's not an easy political situation in Europe just now. We have to combat at the same time terrorism, and at the same time maintaining a decent liberal immigration policy.
Right.
It could be done, but we need to rethink some of the measures we have used, and we need to cooperate much more closely inside the European Union than we have done before, but hopefully stick to the fundamental principles of asylum, for instance.
So confronting xenophobia and Islamophobia is one aspect, but the fight against terror invariably has a cascading effect on a state's attitude or a society's attitude towards civil liberties, towards individual freedoms. We've seen in France, for example, President Hollande make some pretty tough speeches and, in a way, prepare the French people to get ready to give up some of the things that they took for granted. Do you think that this is also a debate where politicians need to be extremely careful that you don't give up things that end up making the situation worse?
They need to be careful, obviously. But at the same time, there is a popular demand to take measures in the direction the French government just now is going. Look up on the opinion polls for Mr. Hollande. For the first time, they are going up.
That's right.
Yes. And the difficult thing for a politician in such a situation is to be able to defend the fundamental principles of an open society. Meanwhile, you are combating hard the terrorist attacks and the roots of terrorism. It's a very delicate balance. And it is easy to see that it can go in the wrong direction and create a society we don't want to live in. If we mistake our ability to combat terrorism, that will also, on the other hand, create a society we don't want to live in. So we are challenged now, no doubt.
Right. On that note, Mr. Persson, our time is completely up. Thank you so much for joining us on Rajya Sabha TV.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That wraps up this episode of Indian Standard Time. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you so much for watching.